We have had a request that we look at a part A on E P Sanders. So E P Sanders comes into theme 2D, which is Luther and justification by faith alone. And as a reminder, on the AS paper of this year, there was a Luther question, and it was on why Luther rejects the Epistle of James. That does not mean that this topic won't be tested again, because of course, if you're sitting the A2 exam this year, you're not going to be sitting the AS exam this year. That would be really, really unlikely. So it's possible they could ask another Luther question, and this might be a way to ask the same topic again, but use untested material, because there has never been an E P Sanders question. So if we look very quickly at the specification, this is theme 2D. It's called Religious Life, Faith and Works. And so on the spec, it says Luther's argument for justification by faith alone, and Luther's rejection of James 2:24. So this little bit of the spec has been tested. The Council of Trent as a response to Luther, and E P Sanders and the role of works in justification. Please don't forget, that could be the question. What was the response of the Council of Trent to Luther? When it comes to part 2s, it's either going to be the extent to which both faith and works are aspects of justification, and you could refer to Luther and E P Sanders and the letters in there, or the extent to which the New Testament letters support arguments for justification by faith alone. And again, you could use E P Sanders and Luther and possibly N.T. Wright when answering that question. So we have already shared a part A answer to a straight Luther question on justification, but this is an E P Sanders answer. And as always, as I talk you through the answer, I'm going to look at where I am using my religious language and key terms, and in particular the language of E P Sanders, where my evidence and sources of wisdom are going to come from. So I have got some little snippets of not really quotes, to be honest, but ideas from Sanders, but also some references to the letters of St. Paul. My main scholar is E P Sanders. Now I did want to include, or I have included at the end, some N.T. Wright. And then I'm going to show where I'm linking back to the question, because of course, to get into the top band, you have to be constantly addressing the question. And so hopefully, if I've done my job properly, I will have a link back to the question in each paragraph. As always, I type these up in 20 minutes. I do go and look at my notes beforehand, but then I take a break, go and have a cup of tea, go out for a walk, and come back and type these up under exam conditions. So no Bible, no notes whilst I'm doing this, so that it's more realistic for you. So these are not perfect answers, but it's quite rare that a student comes up with a perfect answer under exam conditions. But the level of knowledge and the use of evidence and focus on the question and language should be enough to get you an AA star. So, in this question, because I knew that I had a lot to write about E P Sanders, I haven't done an introduction, and that was the right decision, because I was typing constantly for 20 minutes and I had no time to spare, and I could think of one of the two things that ideally I would have put in. So I've gone straight into my writing on this answer. So E P Sanders claims that in first century Palestine, there was a Jewish belief or an approach to justification called covenantal nomism. And that is the idea that the Jewish people were chosen to be saved by God. They were chosen as his special people. And that's the first stage of justification. But then to remain being justified, they have to do good works. And then I talk about the evidence that E P Sanders uses, because this is quite controversial. A little bit like Crossan uses non-canonical books or writings to reach conclusions about Jesus. E P Sanders does the same. And on reflection, I wonder whether on a part B on the use of apocryphal writings and Crossan, you could make a link with E P Sanders, but that only occurred to me as I was writing out this answer. So he uses rabbinic literature of the time. He uses the Dead Sea Scrolls and apocryphal writings. He does, like Crossan, reject a few of St. Paul's letters and reject some Old Testament writings in order to support his case. So if you have a part B, that is a point to raise, that lots of scholars are critical of the methods that E P Sanders uses, because he is selective in his use of scripture or evidence rather, and he also goes to non-obvious sources of wisdom, so beyond the canonical Hebrew Bible or New Testament Bible, and that is a good evaluation point to make. So, in terms of key terms, in that very first paragraph, I've spoken about covenantal nomism a few times. So, E P Sanders said that the gospel writers and later writers like Luther have presented the Jewish faith as being obsessed with keeping the law, and it's not a fair depiction of what it was to be Jewish in the first century. Okay, and some evidence of this, I don't know whether this is E P Sanders' example, it was just one that came to me, but you could use it, is that the rabbis are constantly, or the Jewish teachers in the Gospels are constantly, it feels like, trying to catch Jesus out. You know, you've picked corn on the Sabbath day. How dare you? You've healed someone on the Sabbath day. How dare you? And Sanders, so he's obviously my scholar, points out that that's just incredibly unfair. And actually, if you look at rabbinic writing, so that's my source of wisdom, of the time, you can see that that isn't the way that Jewish teachers interpreted the law. They weren't using it as a way of excluding people, of saying you're outside of justification. They were using it to include as many people as possible. You might remember that we watched in class that video of N.T. Wright talking about Sanders, where he says that the rabbis were actually men of great humour, and they tell a joke that none of us in class found funny, but he also talks about the fact that they would almost bend the law so that people could be kept inside of it, rather than this sort of real rigid law comes first and people after. And so Sanders says that just as Luther comes to a realisation that God isn't holding him to an impossible standard of righteousness. If you remember, he has that tower moment where he realises that he's misunderstanding Romans 1:17. In a similar fashion, the Torah never asks what is unreasonable. The expectations of keeping the Torah are reasonable. They are fair. And my evidence for that is the book of Deuteronomy, where in chapter 30, but you don't need to remember it's chapter 30, it says what God has commanded is within your reach. And E P Sanders says that within Jewish life there was an expectation that you would just do your best to keep the law, and if you went wrong, as you would repent and you would atone for your sin, and everything would be right again. And therefore, for E P Sanders, works have a role to play in justification, but this is not an unrealistic expectation. And so I've linked back to the question there. Next paragraph, E P Sanders says that when we want to understand Paul's views on justification, we need to look at how he views Jesus, because E P Sanders says that Paul kind of goes backwards. So he starts with the idea that Jesus is the solution, but if Jesus is the solution, there has to be a problem. So there has to be a problem with the Mosaic law if you're going to think that Jesus is the solution. Okay, and evidence for that comes from the book of Romans, where St. Paul says that righteousness comes through Jesus. And so that suggests that it doesn't come through the Mosaic law, which would count as a key term there. And for St. Paul, the problem with the Mosaic law is that salvation or justification is only offered to the Gentiles. And we know that from St. Paul's conversion, which is in Acts 9, that the mission given to St. Paul was to witness to the Gentiles. Well, he's not going to have very much luck if he goes to the Gentiles and says, you can be saved if you become Jewish, if you become one of God's chosen people. That's excluding them. And so you can see that in the setting of the early church, which is where these letters have come from, it makes sense for St. Paul to have a focus on you will be saved because you believe in Jesus, because that's open to everybody regardless of your background or your ethnicity. So E P Sanders says that Paul comes up with a new form of covenantal nomism. But rather than you entering a state of salvation because of the covenant, because you are an Israelite or you're one of God's chosen people or you're a descendant of Abraham, you enter being justified because you believe in Jesus. And so that is how this new form of covenantal nomism is happening. And so when St. Paul talks in his letters about justification, he's talking about what transfers you, and that's the phrase E P Sanders uses, what transfers you from being outside of justification to inside of justification. Previously, being an Israelite entered you into justification, but that's not the case anymore because St. Paul is coming to witness to the Gentiles. And so what puts you inside the justification camp is your faith in Jesus and then being baptized. But then, once you have entered that state of grace, there is an expectation that you will do good works as a result of your faith. Just as for the Jewish people, they entered that state of grace by virtue of being Jewish, but then there was an expectation that you would do good works afterwards. But what gets you into the saved camp is belief. So good works doesn't earn you salvation, but it keeps you being saved. N.T. Wright, and I've used him, so I've got a second scholar, but I'm stressing that he's building on Sanders' theory so that I am linking back with the question. And he says that also by good works, St. Paul might have been talking about things like keeping the food laws or being circumcised. And we know that St. Paul was criticised by Jewish Christians and in fact attacked by the Jewish authorities because he was reaching out to Gentiles. And this leads him to say things like circumcision is nothing. And that's in 1 Corinthians. And so there must have been a pressure on St. Paul to say to the Gentile Christians, if you want to be saved, you need to be circumcised. And St. Paul is railing against that. And so N.T. Wright, building on Sanders, says that perhaps when St. Paul is dismissing works, he's also perhaps dismissing ideas that you needed to be circumcised in order to be saved. And so to link back to the question, I've written that when St. Paul is talking about being justified by faith and not good works, he could have been referring to circumcision not being needed for justification rather than there not being a need for good works at all. Then, to bring me back to the question, if you have time, I have summarised my essay. And so to summarise, E P Sanders says St Paul is suggesting an adapted version of covenantal nomism. So I've got my language in there. You are being transferred, and that's almost a source of wisdom because that's E P Sanders' phrase, into the justified group through baptism and belief in Jesus. But good works are needed to remain in the justified camp.